All right, excellent. It's 9 o'clock here. It looks like we have pretty much everyone we had numbers wise the last couple days, so that's excellent. We may have a few more trickle in. Hello and welcome to the Great Outdoors, presented by Dan Dillner. My name is Ryan Baker Dunn, and I will be the moderator for this session. We are recording this session for future use. Looks like everyone's microphone is already muted, but if it's not, please confirm it is. We do ask that if possible, you keep your cameras on throughout the training for engagement. We're using the chat for any questions that you have. So please, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, put them in there. We'll be taking breaks after each section, and I'll read off any questions to Dan, as well as we'll have some time for questions at the end. So other than that, the attendance link is pinned in a comment at the top of the chat. So if you can please fill that out before the end of the session, that would be great. And without further ado, here's Dan Dillner. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you for turning a few cameras on. It's nice for me to see a couple faces at least. I did have the privilege of doing this presentation in person at, I think, the last statewide in-person training that we did. So that was fun, but I like to see faces, so I feel like I'm not just talking to my computer screen. So I appreciate that. So today, yeah, my presentation is entitled The Great Outdoors, but we're going to be covering lots of things. But just first, a little bit of background before I start the presentation. So I worked with the protection program under state forestry for 16 years, and I've been doing this presentation for probably the last, I don't know, 5 or 6. Before I worked for forest protection, I was a parks maintenance technician, and before that I was a park ranger or park manager for I think 9 seasons. So I have quite a lot invested in the state parks as well as forestry, and I know what you're all up against this season. So I feel for that, and I've got some tips to share with you of how to make a better season, and how to interact with our department and the other protection foresters. So. And this also is actually going to be my last year giving this presentation. I've been a protection forester, like I said, for 16 years, and now I'm moving on to run our fire program. So I'll still be involved with the department, but probably see a little less of me in the state parks for work, so sadly. But still going to be around, and I'm going to be putting you in really good hands next year with Emily Meacham, who's a protection forester out of St. John's, who will be giving this presentation. So. Without further ado, I will share my screen. Like Ryan said, at the end of each section, we're going to open up for questions, and then also at the end. All right. Make sure we're set here. All right, so my talk today, everybody can see my screen, a thumbs up. Excellent. Okay, so my talk today is poison ivy, ticks, hazard trees, emerald ash borer, firewood, things that can kind of wreck your vacation or wreck your season in the park. But also Rob coined the term a few years ago, the great outdoors. Both the objectives for this presentation today, and we've got a lot to cover in about an hour, so we'll keep moving pretty quickly. But I want you to be able to identify poison ivy after this presentation. Learn some ways to protect yourselves from ticks, identify some common hazards in trees, be able to recognize signs and symptoms of emerald ash borer, and know the ever-changing FPR policy for bringing firewood into parks. Okay, so first up is poison ivy. I'm sure many of you are knowledgeable about poison ivy, but I want to go over some of the identifying characteristics, because it is a little bit difficult to identify poison ivy sometimes, and many of the parks have a fair amount of it, especially the Champlain Island parks. If you're new to that area, there's a lot of it, and then along the valley areas like the Connecticut Valley as well. So poison ivy is a plant that is very different in its form. It can be quite variable. Let me see if you can see my pointer here. This is a really good picture because it shows, you know, several different types of leaves. So the leaf could look like a heart shape here. It could be round, could be kind of long and thin like ivy. It can have serrations, look more like an oak leaf. So the size and shape of the leaf is not a good identifying feature for poison ivy. Things I look for, you've all heard the saying, leaves of three, let it be. That is a good protocol, but there are other plants, as I'll show you in a minute, that do have leaves of three. So leaves in groups of three, the center leaf having this kind of elongated petiole, that helps me identify poison ivy. And then like this leaf here, where the veins of that leaf are nice and parallel. That's also a good way to identify it. So the poison ivy can be, it's a woody plant, it can be a shrub, it can be a vine with 2 inches in diameter going 100 feet up in a tree. It can have lateral branches coming off of it. It has many forms, but being a woody plant means it comes back each year, and to kill it, you actually need to kill it down the entire plant and the roots and the runners that go throughout the plants that are connected. Just kind of a close-up of the plant. It has berries by mid to late summer. They turn white. They're called drupes. They're actually, believe it or not, an important food for birds. So, and then the birds eat them and poop out the seeds and spread poison ivy. So every part of the plant contains the oils that are toxic to most humans, and you can get poison ivy from any part of the plant. So off season, like right now, before the leaves come out, the woody stems are still containing the oils, and if you cut them when you're trimming brush or roadside, you can get poison ivy. You can even get it in the winter. So it's can be pretty nasty, but just be really cautious and careful when you're out trimming roadsides, brush. A really good tip for park staff is if you're in a park with poison ivy, if you're mowing the road edge or campsites and you're going to work on and clean your mower deck afterwards, wear gloves because you could get oils on your hands from the poison ivy. And I have seen that happen at Kilcare, Burton Island, Grand Isle. So be cautious. So again, these are the little berries, and the birds eat them, and they can reseed new areas. So poison ivy loves disturbed spots. So if you have poison ivy in your park and you're going to do a lot of cleaning out of the brush in the area, you're going to make a nice new spot for poison ivy. So this is kind of a good slide that shows you some of the main lookalikes with poison ivy in the same picture. So if you look up here in the top left, this plant is called hog peanut, leaves of 3, center stem longer, but it's not a woody plant. It's an annual. It comes back from the seed each year, and so it's less. I don't know, less. It's not a woody stem, much thinner stem. To me, it doesn't look like poison ivy, but people often get confused. This other plant here called Virginia creeper. The leaves look a little similar to poison ivy, but they're in groups of 5. But the weird thing about Virginia creeper is the stem looks very similar. It's a vine, woody. They often grow right together. When I'm controlling poison ivy, it's like they're next to each other all the time. And then this plant here is actually poison ivy. You can see here on the right. All right, so a little quiz here for you folks. So there's 4 pictures here. Take a look and see if you can identify which ones are or are not poison ivy. All right, so starting in the top left, poison ivy or not poison ivy? If you guess not poison ivy, you were right. It is in fact Virginia creeper. All right, the top right. I see some thumbs up. Yes, you're right. That is poison ivy. That is probably late summer or during a drought where the leaves are starting to die back. Maybe you've seen poison ivy in the fall. It turns bright red. Actually, it can be quite nice foliage, especially up on the Maine coast. But in this picture, the foliage is dying back. You can see the veins of the leaves where the color is starting, but it's certainly much drier. All right, how about the next one, the bottom left? I see some thumbs up. Yeah, this is poison ivy. This is what it looks like early season, probably mid to late May, very early June when it's just starting to put out new leaves. They come out red, small, um, you know, really soft, succulent leaves, lots of juice ready to get on you. So be cautious if you see that. That is definitely an easy time to get it because the leaves are so thin and easy to get the oils on your skin. All right, how about the bottom right? I see some thumbs down. You're correct. This is in fact not poison ivy. It is let's go back here. This is wild sarsaparilla, and actually you can make beverage from the roots. But it's pretty common in a lot of the parks, especially drier areas. Um, with some pine overstory. I've had lots of parks over the years text me pictures of wild sarsaparilla thinking maybe it was poison ivy, but it is not. All right, another quiz number 2. Take a look at these photos and see what you think. All right, so starting at the top left, what do you think? Poison ivy? I see some thumbs up, but maybe hesitating. It is in fact poison ivy, but it does look a little bit different than some of the other pictures we saw. Often when the leaves are around the bright sunlight, they're much lighter green. So it's, you can see here it's growing out of a fence from another area, and very elongate, kind of skinny leaves, but it is poison ivy. All right, how about the top right here? I see no. Yeah, it's correct. This is in fact Virginia creeper again. And then how about the bottom left? No, thumbs down. You're right. This is that hog peanut. So it's in the legume family. So it has little fruits that look like peas. I don't think they're edible. They might be slightly poisonous, but certainly it's not a toxic plant. And then the one on the bottom right. That's definitely not poison ivy. It is in fact a weed. All right, so you've identified that your park has poison ivy. The next important thing to do is to make a map. As a protection forester that comes into your park with a lot of other things to do besides poison ivy, a lot of duties, including fire and forest health. If you can make it so it's more efficient for us to come into the park and having all the areas pre-identified, that will make it so we can get more done in a shorter amount of time. So making a really good map is very important, and contacting your protection forester as early in the season as you can. Obviously, you have to wait for the plants to come out and spend some time there, but if you could possibly contact them by June 1st. At the end of this presentation, I'll put up the contacts for all the protection foresters and the areas that they cover. But getting the map made early, you're out and about raking campsites, getting things open. Keep a map on your UTV or your truck, golf cart, whatever, and identify the areas. We try to get to the parks and spray. Sometimes if you have a lot of parks that need to be controlled that year, you may not get to all of them, but keep the map. And then if you, even after we have come and controlled poison ivy in your park, there may be some spots we missed or we couldn't get to because of visitors, but keep a map posted in the contact station for next year's staff coming in. And then we can control the areas. Grand Isle, I sprayed for years, and it is probably the park with the most areas to control. But if you hit a park really hard one year, sometimes you don't need to come back the next year. And it's a good point here to make is this is not an eradication program. We're never going to eradicate poison ivy. We're not attempting to. It's a native plant. But the idea is to control it, keep it back, so keep visitors. I mean, I've seen kids in shorts and no shirt playing in poison ivy, and it's like we want to avoid that. So typically we would control it like maybe 5 or 10 feet off the edge of the campsite, off trails, road edges. We're not going to go out into the woods and try to kill it. It's important to note that if you go into an area and kill all the plants, including the poison ivy, then you're going to have invasive plants coming in and more poison ivy. So it's it's critical for when we control it to really carefully try to kill just the poison ivy. All right. When we're spraying the poison ivy, it's not only is it important, it's required that by law, according to the label of the it's a pesticide. Actually it's a herbicide. It is glyphosate that we spray to control poison ivy. So we won't need to follow the label very carefully. We are also folks spraying will be our certified pesticide applicators. So you need to post notices in the park so that the visitors can be aware. And there's going to be signs pre-made available for you. So contact your supervisors and they will have them, whether you can print them out or maybe some pre-printed that you can post so folks can know. When you're coordinating with the protection forester, reach out to them, let them know when, that you have poison ivy, and they'll try to schedule a day. It may not be a lot of notice because when you're spraying poison ivy, you need to have good weather. For the herbicide to work well, you need to have dry foliage, and it needs to be dry, good, warm, dry conditions for the chemicals to be stuck onto the plant so it can be taken up in the leaves. And just, unlike if you were spraying a herbicide on a lawn where it would turn brown probably that day, it does take poison ivy a week or two for it to die. So just because we control it, it's still going to look like poison ivy for a little while. It's really helpful, especially in a larger park and with a lot of areas to control, to have somebody from the park staff accompany the protection forester when they're spraying so they can talk to park visitors, because often we're going to be wearing PPE and it might be frightening to visitors if someone's wearing a backpack sprayer. So we're not actually spraying like in the bottom photo. We're not going to be spraying like huge areas. We're going to be carrying a backpack sprayer and controlling individual plants. But some of us like to wear a Tyvek suit, maybe a respirator, and it's ideal to talk to the park visitors. Someone from the staff to say, hey, this is what's going on. Occasionally, although I've only seen it probably maybe twice in 16 years, if someone is actually upset that we're using herbicides in the park, and they may be very upset about it, maybe asking us to leave. In that case, we just leave the area and we'll make a note on the map and we'll get it later. The idea of getting us notified early in the season so we can control when there's fewer visitors. And June is a great time because the plant is growing really vigorously. It's actually the best time to control it. And there's obviously less folks coming in the park, especially during the week in June. So coordinate with your protection forester and try to come up with a time in the season or time of the week when it's good. We would try to avoid things like Friday afternoons to coming in and spray. But you may need to mark off the area where we're going to control so that the re-entry is once the product is dry on the leaves. So it may only take 5 or 10 minutes for it to dry if it's a good dry day. But it may be very important to mark off the area to keep folks out of it. Then, like I said, communicating with park visitors is very key. So open it up for questions. It looks like there's a lot of chatter. I can't see the chat that well, but if you guys, Ryan or somebody, can read the questions in the chat to me, that'd be great. Ryan, are you there?
Yeah, sorry, my microphone was having a challenge. No questions yet, but keeping an eye on the chat. So if anything does pop up, I will let you know.
Okay, great. We'll keep moving then. Okay, so the next section is about ticks and how to protect yourself. I am not a specialist in ticks. I am not, that knowledgeable about, healthcare, but I'm going to give you some tips that I've learned. I've been through a lot of trainings over the years about ticks, and I know many foresters have gotten Lyme disease. So there's some things to help you protect yourself, but I really encourage you, if you have any real deep questions about ticks or Lyme disease, to contact your healthcare provider, go to the CDC website, or the Vermont Department of Health has a lot of great information, which I'll be referencing here. So just kind of, I think there's 18 different pathogens transmitted by ticks in the United States. In Vermont, there's about 5, but really the most common one that we're concerned with in Vermont is really Lyme disease. That's probably the most common disease. There are others, but it's all of them. Really, it's similar in terms of what you're going to do to prevent it. So, but we're going to concentrate mostly on Lyme disease. But this kind of just shows you. This was the latest map I was able to find from 2019. Just kind of shows you where Lyme disease is. And unfortunately, the Northeast, and as things move, as the climate tends to move and warm up a little bit, it is moving up in our area. I think there's some error in the data showing Massachusetts not having any Lyme disease, but definitely Vermont, especially, well, you can see here the most common areas. The southern counties are really, really prevalent, coming up on the Champlain, Connecticut Valley. Northeast Kingdom, not as much, but it's still there. I live right on the edges of Northeast Kingdom in far eastern Franklin County, and we're getting deer ticks here now as well too. So the ticks are out. There's been a number of ticks this season here. I'm itching already. So 2 main species of ticks that you're really going to come in contact with. There are others, but the main ones you're going to find is one of them is the American dog tick, also known as the wood tick. It's a larger tick, orange legs, tend to move pretty quickly. Really not commonly transmitting diseases in Vermont. They do. There's a couple diseases they can transmit, but it's really actually quite rare. So besides being nasty, they are not quite the danger as the black-legged tick, which we'll show next. But these are common, especially in areas in central Vermont, northeast, like Groton area. Lots of dog ticks. But the main thing that we're really mostly concerned about because of disease is, the correct name is really the black-legged tick, but they're often commonly called deer ticks. Kind of shows you deer ticks here from left to right. So this is a larva, and then a nymph, an adult male, and adult female. So just the larva, thankfully, because you can barely see them, the larvae do not transmit disease. So it's really the nymphs and the adults that we're concerned about. I see people shaking their heads and making bad faces. Yes, ticks are nasty. But it's just the way it is. A little bit about the life cycle. It's complicated, and it's a 2-year life cycle, but you don't need to memorize all this. But just realize that, the time when you're going to be most likely to get infected is, spring. So they're out now, and then throughout the summer, and then, again, more in the fall. But right now, there's eggs are being laid. They hatch out as larvae, and so the larvae do not actually contain any pathogens yet because they haven't picked them up. So the larvae are feeding on small mammals and birds, and then they go throughout the fall, and then they hatch out as a nymph in the spring. So there'll be nymphs out as well as adults in the spring, so the 2 different stages at once, and they both can transmit Lyme. The nymphs are nasty because they're really hard to see. Unfortunately, they're very, very small. And then they'll feed on they always call them deer ticks, but really they feed on lots of mammals. The nymphs seem to really love chipmunks, so and mice. So calling them deer ticks is not really the best, the best way to identify them because they are in other mammals as well. So then the nymphs, the nymphs going out through the summer, and then hatching out as adults, and then again maybe another feeding in the fall before winter. But the adults are active. They can be active all winter if there's any warm spells. I know folks that live in southern Vermont, southwestern Vermont, dogs will pick up ticks all year. Kind of shows you the time throughout the year when the ticks are Lyme disease is most commonly picked up in Vermont. They're kind of peaking in midsummer. So Vermont Department of Health has a program called Be Tick Smart. And, the premise of it is protect yourself, check yourself, remove ticks, and watch. So we're going to go over that in detail. Protect yourself. You know, the first thing they say is avoiding places where ticks live. Well, you can look at the habitat and the range of the black-legged tick. Um, it might be a little bit hard to avoid all the areas where ticks live, but they do tend to like brushy areas, tall grass, areas with more limestone type soils. So the Champlain Valley is, really ticks are very prevalent, going all along the Rutland County, Connecticut Valley on the other side. So, if you have to work in an area where there's lots of ticks, try to stay on trails, try to keep vegetation from brushing on you. But really, the best thing you can do is protect yourself. And that's with covering up, wearing treated clothing, which we'll talk more about in a minute. Gaiters can be a really great way to keep ticks from, just trying to keep barriers from ticks from crawling up into your clothing. So whether you tuck your socks in your pant legs, or I like to wear gaiters that I can take on and off, and the gaiters are treated, or wearing boots, my pants tucked into them. But using a tick repellent can be good, using DEET on your skin, but also this permethrin on clothing. So here's a picture of the permethrin. It's really key that you understand that permethrin is not for skin. So don't put it on your skin. Don't put your clothing on and then spray your pant legs with the permethrin. Treat it ahead of time so that the garment can dry. You hang it up outside. Make sure you're not going to be breathing in the vapors. It only takes a few minutes on a dry day for your clothing to dry, and then they'll be very effective at keeping ticks off. I've watched them get on my treated clothing and they kind of quiver and their legs kind of curl and they fall off. So it really works extremely well. I like to put my treated clothing on, when I go out to do something, and then come back in. And if I've been in an area where I know the place is infested with ticks, I'll often put my clothing in a plastic bag and until I can put it in the dryer for maybe 10 minutes on high heat to kill any ticks. Check yourself. You know, check every area of your body. Use a mirror. Between your legs, under your waistband, back of your neck. They love to get the back of your neck, behind your ears. Waistband is really a place where they love to be. Under your arms, on your side, places you can't see or reach well is where they like to be. I often actually wear a hat and have my hat treated, so ticks can't jump, but they could potentially be on vegetation and fall on you. But yeah, check your whole body, take a shower. It's a good way to look. If you check yourself every single night before you go to bed, then there's no way you're ever going to have a tick attached for more than 24 hours. And that's really what they say, you know, is, it's not a hard rule, but it's very less likely to get Lyme disease if you have a tick that's removed within 24 hours. If you do have a tick that's attached, you want to carefully remove it. And if you think there's any chance you got it at work, you want to go to the first report of injury and that system. You contact, I'm sure you'll get training on that with your supervisor on how to do that. If it turns into future complications, you want to have documented that you got it at work. But carefully remove the tick as quick as you can, whether you use sharp tweezers or there's lots of little tools to remove the tick. But don't squeeze the tick with your fingernail. Don't put something on it like Vaseline or a chemical or a hot match head or something, because that will just tend to make the tick. It'll make it release quickly, but it'll also maybe inject more saliva into you, which would contain the pathogen. So do not do that. It's very likely the mouth parts are going to break off in you. Don't worry about that. You might get a bump there, might get a little infection, but it isn't going to be it's not going to mean you're more likely to get Lyme disease. I don't know how many times that I've actually been able to pull a tick off and include the mouth parts. It just rarely happens. So don't freak out. But if you have a tick and you think it's been attached enough where it started to engorge, I would definitely call your doctor, and they may want to give you a preventative dose of antibiotic just to be safe. But again, contact your healthcare provider. So if you feel like if you've actually had a tick bite, you want to make sure and watch for the symptoms. Not everyone's going to get all the symptoms, and that you've often seen pictures of the bullseye rash. That doesn't happen with everyone. It doesn't happen. It only happens a small percentage of the time, actually. So check all, all these things could be going on, but just be careful. If you're getting a summer cold, or just kind of fever, aches and chills, you ought to check with your healthcare provider and make sure that you don't have Lyme disease. Yeah, so that's what we talked about. There's this good guidebook that's linked to it, is on the Vermont Department of Health, and it's from the CDC, but just kind of talks about the tick-borne, the different diseases and ticks in the United States, and it gives you a little bit more information. Questions?
Not about ticks, but we'd had a question related to poison ivy, if we have a program for giant hogweed at all.
We do. The protection foresters are not out controlling invasives in the parks right at this point. It's just not something we have time at the moment to do, but there is, if you go to the VT Invasives website, you can see about all the different invasives, and there is folks to contact there, and there is a invasive plant coordinator, and they might be able to get some program going, maybe with some volunteers or park staff to help control other invasives, including hogweed or poison parsnip.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. I will throw that link for VT Invasives up in the chat.
Yep.
I do have a question from Mount Philo. Do we need to save black-legged ticks for testing if removed from visitors or staff for testing?
If you remove it from yourself or staff, it's not a bad idea to save it if it's been especially if it's been on for a amount of time. You could go to the Vermont Department of Health, and then I think also there's a person from the Agency of Agriculture who was doing a program last year where she was actually collecting some ticks. So I can maybe put a link in the chat about that. But I would save a tick if it's been attached, put it in the freezer in a Ziploc bag or something, just in case someone wants to test it. But I think it's rare that anyone's going to test it for disease, because they think they pretty much know that the majority of ticks actually contain Lyme disease. So if you have one, they're probably just going to say, yeah, it's a tick, and they're going to give you treatment. So I don't know if it's necessary to save every tick, but if you have one that's engorged, I probably would put it in the freezer in case it's someone that would want to look at it.
All right, awesome.
Or you can save in alcohol as well.
Great, thank you. And then finally, one question from Stillwater: are woodchuck ticks a problem in parks?
Woodchuck ticks, that's an interesting question. They're the same, I believe they're the same genus as the black-legged tick. They do transmit some diseases, less likely than deer ticks. They're not as common, but where they show up, they tend to show up. So if you have woodchucks or skunks a lot, they can be. I know I have some friends that have brought woodchuck ticks to me to identify several times, and they look a little bit like a deer tick or a black-legged tick. I can't say they're probably the most common problem. They really tend to be on those animals and in like burrows, and so maybe if you have a cat that's getting into those areas after mice or something, and then they might get the woodchuck tick on them, and then the woodchuck tick might get on you or in your house. It's not as common, but it is possible.
All right, excellent. I think that's all we have for questions for now. Thank you all.
We'll move on. Okay. Next section is on hazard trees. So the protection foresters, another part of their job besides spraying poison ivy is identifying hazard trees for removal. So this is done in the fall, and it's done, as soon as the park closed, we try to get the hazard trees marked, and it might just be a few trees in a small park or a lot of trees in a larger park. And so, but that's 6 months ago at least that we were out there. So it's a lot of things can happen in the winter. So between winter storms, or we're also human beings and we could have missed them. So sometimes we do them with leaf on and we don't see the trees as well, or sometimes we don't notice something hiding behind another tree. So your job as park staff are to keep your visitors safe. So if you see something, say something. If you see a tree that looks like it might be a hazard, I would say first reach out to your maintenance technician and say, hey, this tree, what do you think about it? You don't need our permission to cut a tree. If the park maintenance technician says, yeah, it's definitely a hazard, it needs to be cut, don't need our permission to do that. But if you like, if you have a tree that, yeah, you're not really sure, it looks like it might be, contact the protection foresters, and someone they'll come out and take a look at your tree and see if it needs to come down. So here I just want to show you some common things that would be hazards that you might see in a park that would help help you identify them. So a hazard, for a tree to be a hazard, it has to have a target. So you can go out in the woods and, we'll go way out on a trail or wherever and see all kinds of trees with problems. But if they don't have a target, it's really not a hazard tree. So that's really what we're concerned about. And there's a couple different ways to eliminate that risk. One is you can remove the hazard by cutting the tree down or cutting the branch off the tree, or you could remove the target. Well, if it's a campsite, it might be hard to remove that target. But if it's a bench under a really large, mostly healthy tree, it's possible we could move the bench instead of cutting the whole tree down. So, or maybe not mow that area around that tree so that it wouldn't necessarily have a target. So there's other options besides just cutting the tree down. But in general, if a tree is, a hazard tree, that we usually either take it down or prune it. So one thing to look for would be, after heavy snow loads or ice accumulation after the winter, you might have a tree that looks fine. Look until you notice closely, it may have something called stress cracks. So these cracks can be in the branches. It's often common on trees like box elder or red or silver maple, where they may have a lot of lateral branches coming out that could hold a fair amount of weight and then cause some cracking. So that'd be prone to failure. It would be considered a hazard, especially if it had a target like a campsite underneath it where it could break on somebody. So that would potentially need to be removed. And it may be the whole tree that has to come down if it's the whole stem, or it may just need a branch that you could prune off yourself. Signs of internal decay that may be harder to see whether a tree actually is compromised on the inside. Often trees that are rotten inside still have good foliage, not a lot of dieback at the top. So you need to look for other things like woodpecker activity. If you're raking the campsite and you haven't had a lot of visitors and you notice that, geez, there's all this wood chips all over the site. Well, look up. Maybe has been a lot of woodpecker activity and they've been working inside the stem to try to find wood-boring larvae that will live in a decayed tree, and that would be a good sign to indicate that the structure of the tree is not sound and it could break off. There's a storm out there that'll take down any tree, so we're trying to reduce the chance of trees that have defects coming down on a visitor. Looking for things like fruiting bodies, mushrooms on the side of the tree that indicates there's a fungus inside and decay. Overhead hazards, storm could break off a branch and hang, sometimes called widowmakers, but we've kind of tend to call them spousal removers now. But they can come down on someone's head or on their vehicle. But so yeah, when you're out and about, look up as well as around you. Dead limbs, we can't cut every single branch off a tree, but if the branch, there's a lot of dead branches more than 1.5 inches, 2 inches, then you definitely would want to be figuring out how to get these pruned. If you have a branch that's 3 or 4 inches in diameter and it's 30, 40 feet up over a campsite or a bench, that could really cause some harm. Root problems, that's a good thing to look for, which, our trees in the parks are often taking a beating. I mean, they're in a site where they're getting a lot of compaction from vehicles and human traffic. So that compaction makes the soil so water tends to run off more. The trees have less access to water and nutrients, and some of the roots may may die, especially during droughts. Now we've had droughts the last 2 summers, so it wouldn't be unlikely to see trees that are having some problems this year following the last couple of years of drought. So if you notice when you're mowing or raking, you see a spot where the ground is being lifted up by the roots. So that's a sign, like over in this picture on the left here, a sign that this tree is the roots are broken, maybe from heavy wind, or maybe it's some decay and the tree could potentially come down. Or this this tree down in the bottom right, where the tree looks pretty healthy, but you're seeing some mushrooms or some fruiting bodies from fungus along the bottom edge of the tree that can indicate that there's some root issues and the tree may need to be removed. Like I said, there's storms in the summertime, and once trees are fully leaved out, they become pretty good sail. So if you get microburst in the summer, heavy winds from a thunderstorm, definitely take a ride around your park right afterwards, because there could be some tree damage, and trees maybe were healthy, but now they need to be removed. The tree, this picture down in the bottom left here, this probably a fairly healthy tree, but it was multi-stemmed when it was younger and growing, and so the two stems have been pushing against each other, and now they've loosened up and much weaker and could break off, especially in a storm. So that might be something that would need to be removed. Any questions?
Yeah, Dan, so we had one question from Grand Isle. It may have already been answered in the chat, but in case of a trail or walking path, would moving targets still be considered a target? And do we mark those trees?
We don't typically mark hazard trees on like nature trails, like say bathroom trails to the restrooms. We would mark them, probably not quite as detailed as we would on a campsite. We're going to be really much more, every little thing. But on a road edge or a trail, probably not quite as. We're going to get the hazards, but if it's a tree that's basically pretty healthy, probably not going to be too concerned about it. But looking out on nature trails, there are times where there's just so many trees that are hazards they may need to be removed. But in general, we're really concentrating on campsites, places we actually invite people to spend time, not moving. So like benches, picnic tables, picnic spots, those kinds of areas.
Great, thank you. I think that's all for now.
Okay. All right. The next section we're going to talk, and there's just two more to go. Emerald ash borer. So the emerald ash borer is an invasive insect that's in Vermont. It's actually pretty prevalent now, and it's in the parks. And we want you to keep an eye out for it, because if a tree has emerald ash borer now, it is considered to be a hazard tree. So even if the tree is not even dying back, the folks who are arborists and climb trees, if the tree has emerald ash borer, they will not, it's considered hazardous and they will not climb it. So unfortunately, when we identify emerald ash borer in a park, trees that have it need to be removed. And so your job is basically to help us find new areas so we can get those trees safely removed. So as I said, it's in Vermont. This map shows you so at the current outbreak in the state, the darker areas and the circles are kind of the worst infestations. So the question is, are there ash in Vermont state parks? In 2019, the Protection Foresters went to every single state park and counted all the ash trees. So we counted about 16,000 ash, and these were just trees that if they were dead that day would have been needed to be marked for a hazard. So not all the ash out in the forest, just the ones that were where there was a target. So there's plenty of ash. There is hope. It's not, it's not completely hopeless, but there's a lot of research being done on some control methods for emerald ash borer, especially some parasitic insects that actually attack the emerald ash borer, and we've been doing some releases throughout the state, so it's not completely hopeless, but for now your main job is to identify any new outbreaks for us so we can make sure that folks aren't injured by hazard trees. Now it just shows you, the counties throughout the United States that are currently infested with emerald ash borer, and a little bit about some of the symptoms and signs here in the life cycle. So in the spring, or once the adults are out laying eggs, they lay them in the bark cracks on the tree, and then the larvae hatch out and burrow down under the bark, and they feed in that cambium layer. So it's the area just under the bark So it initially doesn't go down into the wood at all. And so initially the wood is pretty sound. But because they're cutting off, basically strangling the tree, cutting off the flow of water and nutrients, the tree will die within a couple of years. And once the tree's, lots of nutrients, then it starts to be weakened and it can be much more susceptible to to failure and be a hazard. The adults are active, in the early part of the like so maybe mid to late May, early June. An interesting thing with the adults is their timing is almost exactly the same as the flowering of the black locust tree. They're not related in any way, but so if people say, they think they see right now, for instance, they see a green beetle. Well, it's not going to be emerald ash borer flying around now. They would need time to hatch out and become as adults. But it would be about the same time as the black locust flowers are in your area. So just something to think about. But that characteristics, S-shaped galleries under the bark, are really a telltale sign of emerald ash borer. Another thing to look for would be woodpecker activity on the ash. Initially, it's just going to be some bark flecking where the woodpeckers are trying to get the larvae or the pupae down into the bark to feed. But when there's a lot of them, the woodpeckers are really cleaning off the tree, and it actually looks quite orange. So you can, in areas in states where it's a lot of infestations, just driving down the highway, you can see very easily and identify as an emerald ash borer. So that's something to look for as well. Like I said, it's cutting off the flow of water and nutrients, so the top's not getting moisture here or nutrients, and it's getting this, this tufting epicormic branching. That's kind of a good sign that the tree is very, very stressed. And in this case, it's emerald ash borer, but it could be other things causing similar look to trees. So if you think you have emerald ash borer, contact your protection forester, and someone will come out and take a look. Often folks say, look for the D-shaped holes. They're fairly small. It's often hard to see unless you really know what you're looking for or look very closely. These holes are like 1/8 of an inch, so pretty small. But when the adult crawls, after it pupates, it crawls out from under the bark. The top of the insect is flat, round underneath, so the hole is D-shaped. So it's a good identifying feature. So like we mentioned before, this VT invasive. So there's a section on invasive plants, but also invasive insects. So that's a good place to get more information, see the latest maps. It's good to educate yourself about this. The protection foresters, contact them. That they're going to reach out to you, and they can provide outreach materials, brochures, all that kind of stuff that you can give out in your park if you'd like. So questions on emerald ash borer?
Yeah, Dan, we had a question. Is there a treatment for emerald ash borer trees that are infected, like a treatment for hemlock wood or the hemlock woolly from Smuggler's Notch?
So there is treatment you can do to trees for prevention. I think they've demonstrated that if the tree is just a little tiny bit infected and you did the injection to control the insect or to keep it out, that it would probably kill it. But usually by the time it's really hard to see infestations in a tree until it's really actually pretty active. So by the time you've noticed it, it's probably not worth the money. I mean, you're looking at several $100s per tree to be injected, and it's probably not worth the money for a tree that it may not survive. So they are working on a protocol of how to inject trees, and there may be some control going on in some of the parks to pick a few trees to protect. But in order to decide to spend money on each tree, the tree itself has to be healthy. I mean, you don't want to be wasting money on a tree that's already dying back from other things. So in general, there really isn't a way to stop it once it's in a tree that well.
Great. And then a question from Matthew Callahan is is heat treated wood that has an S pattern still safe in parks?
That's a good question. If the wood is heat treated, and we're going to talk about that next. The heat treated USDA certified. I think it'd be very unlikely it had any S-shaped galleries in it. But I suppose if it's heat treated and certified, then it's probably fine. But I would tend to avoid that if I was going to be bringing that wood around.
Great. And then just a quick question, if we have any kind of gypsy moth containment program.
Well, the insect formerly known as gypsy moth is now called spongy moth, so just be aware of that. We do not have a program for containing, and there is not a statewide program for any spraying. But yes, it's very likely that especially parks in the Champlain Valley in Western Vermont are going to see some more spongy moth outbreak this summer. But there really isn't a control program for it.
All right, thank you.
Okay, in the last section, we're in the home stretch here. So, don't move firewood. So all these invasive insects like emerald ash borer, wood boring insects, emerald ash borer, Asian longhorn beetle, they've all come into the United States from often Northern Europe, Asia, because they have similar tree species as us, similar climate, and they came on wood packaging material that was not heat treated. But once they're here, they can move really well in firewood. So that's kind of why we've been worried about, firewood being moved around the state. Always telling people to, buy your firewood locally if possible. So this section, we're going to talk about what the FPR policy is for firewood coming into parks. But first to know that it is actually a state statute and a state law to, it's illegal to move firewood, untreated firewood from out of state into Vermont. So that's not just a park policy, it is actually statute. If you want to read about it, you can go on our website and read all the fine details of that. But for those of you maybe returning park managers, park staff, we've had various versions of a policy for firewood coming into the parks to try to prevent the spread of invasive insects. So things like way back, not allowing wood from 50 miles, and then no wood from out of state, and in the last couple of years, no wood at all coming into the parks. So just want to clearly state what the policy is for this year. So the policy for this year is no firewood coming in from out of state. So we're not going to be regulating if someone comes in with a truckload of wood from just outside the park. We're not going to be confiscating that. So it's just wood that's coming from out of state, which is actually in line with the actual statute. So you can't bring wood in from out of state unless it's prepackaged. So it's going to be prepackaged. It's going to be labeled as heat treated, USDA label that says, heat treated USDA APHIS PPQ. So it's going to have that little shield, like up here in the right. You're going to see this somewhere on the bundle of wood. There's not going to be a lot of wood coming in from out of state. You may get a bag or two, but it's not huge quantities. Certified by the USDA. So just, to reiterate, any folks locally bringing wood in the park, we're not going to be taking their wood. Just wood coming from out of state. As long as it's not heat treated. If it's just, raw firewood coming from out of state, we will actually take that. So here's what you do if you get that non-USDA certified wood coming from out of state. We will ask the visitors to exchange that firewood. So in the past, there's been discussion of, letting them hold an armload to burn for one night. So no, just make it simple. If they bring the wood in, we're going to exchange it. Contact your protection forester. They'll give you bags, special bags to put the wood in. Please do not overload the bags. You want to make it so we can pick the bags up pretty easily. So just, an armload per bag. There's going to be some zip ties to zip tie the bags together, but between the bags, so it's double bagged, between the bags, there'll be some labels that you can put in there if you have time to put some details on the tag of where the wood came from. It's helpful for us to track. And then contact your protection forester when you have some wood to pick up, because they'll come pick it up for you. If you could possibly store the bags under cover, it makes it nicer than having to have bags that are all wet and nasty to carry, because we have to transport them back to a facility, keep them inside a building for the season, and then open them up in the fall and inspect each bag. And that is it for the firewood section. So we can take questions on that and any questions on the whole presentation. It looks like we're still got some time. And okay, here's the contacts for all the protection foresters that cover the different park regions.
It doesn't look like we have any questions on firewood right now, Dan. And we may let people go here just because we have another presentation in 5 minutes. I posted again, but if you haven't, please put the please make sure you've completed the attendance link before we start the next session. Bonus, I counted 3 Robs and 1 Nate throughout the presentation. I don't know if that number is accurate because I was also in the chat, but hopefully you all saw that as well. Thank you so much, Dan, for your presentation. As always, I got a good couple chuckles out of it, and it's always good information. So we will see you all in another 5 minutes here.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, everybody.
Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Take care, everyone. Have a good season. Be safe.